I would just say for the record that my name is Chris Perez and I am interviewing Dr. Robert Babcock. We are in Hastings, Nebraska, and today is Saturday, November 19th, 2016. To begin this interview, I would like to ask you when and where were you born?
I was born on May 31st, 1960 in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania.
Okay. And I was just wondering, what was your childhood like?
I lived in Bryn Mawr, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, until 1966. And then in 1966, my father accepted a position at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and we moved to Columbus, where I lived until I went off to college. And just at the most northern end of Columbus, so not quite the suburbs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what was your socioeconomic class, and what would you say your family belonged to?
Oh, we were middle class.
Middle class.
My father was a recipient of the GI Bill, earned his PhD in classics at the University of California, Berkeley. My mother was a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, and my father went on to be a university professor and then a university administrator. So no, we were comfortably middle class. We lived in, I think, what would probably have been described as the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. We were in the city limits, but we were in one of the new post-war developments. So yeah, comfortably middle class, I suppose.
And this kind of ties in with that kind of answer. So I'm just wondering what your family background was like. And like what I mean by this is that if you could give me information about your family's social and cultural background.
Sure. My father, again, was a college professor, a professor of classics, Fulbright recipient to study in Italy. My mother was also a classics major and what would have been called a housewife in the 1960s, but her degree was from a pretty impressive New England college called Mount Holyoke, which was a school for, and still is a school for women. Both of my parents were, my mom's case, Caucasian children of European immigrants. Both have family trees that go back into the 18th century. We used to tease my sister, and my mother still teases my daughter that she's eligible to be part of the Daughters of the American Revolution if she wants. But that masks a little bit of the reality of my family history. My father's father was an oil field roughneck in the oil fields of California. He married a diner waitress. My mother's father was a chicken farmer in New Jersey back when New Jersey actually had rural areas. Now, it's a little misleading to call Grandpa, my mother's father, a chicken farmer because he got himself educated. He ended up with a PhD in poultry science. He ended up running the Jersey Chick Association, which was so he was significantly more middle class than my father's people were. My paternal grandfather was an oil field roughneck. My paternal mother was a waitress in a diner. And it was really my father's experience in the Second World War that made it possible for something else to happen. He'd won a scholarship to the University of California at Berkeley before the war began. He was a freshman there in 1941. But he'd done it in part through ROTC. And so when the war came, after an odd and interesting experience where it looked like the war was going to be in Asia, so they took all the people majoring in funny languages. Dad was a Latin major, and said, right, you're going to learn an Asian language now. But when FDR decided that the war was going to be prosecuted first in Europe, he was shipped to San Antonio and entered the Army. And it's the GI Bill that made possible his PhD after that. So in one sense, I'm a typical kind of, baby boomer in the sense that I'm a child of a World War II generation, which was a child of a Depression generation in a very, very different America. Is that sort of what you wanted to know? Okay,
yes.
good.
All right.
Good.
And then I don't know if you mentioned it already, but I was just wondering what was your educational background like? And I'm assuming you're from Missouri University.
Yes, I was. I got a bachelor's degree in classics and English at Beloit College in Wisconsin. And then after a couple of years as a failed science fiction writer, I earned a scholarship to the University of Missouri, where I earned my master's degree, and then I finished my doctorate in European history at the University of California at Santa Barbara.
All right. Well, transitioning to the lifetime during the war, I was going to ask you, what were you doing prior to the war starting or prior to your awareness of the war?
I was a kid. In fact, I was a kid for much of the war. Depending upon when historians decide the Vietnam conflict started, it actually started before I was born. With the first, I think the first, what was the euphemism? Military advisors in Southeast Asia under the Eisenhower administration. I was born in 1960, roughly coterminous with the inauguration of President Kennedy. And it's really he who started to escalate American presence in the war. So I mean, or in Vietnam. So I was probably 7 or 8 before I really understood that there were American troops fighting anywhere. When I understood what I understood a war was, World War II. Nobody knew about Korea. Nobody thought about Korea until MASH. So the war films that you saw on mid-afternoon television, the games, the soldier games that you played in the backyard were Nazis and allies. They were World War II things. And I wasn't until I was 7 or 8 that I came, I realized that okay, there's something else going on here too, and that is for a number of different reasons. My father had become Dean of Humanities at The Ohio State University in 1966, and that made him a university administrator at a state university while the war was going on and while there was a growing protest movement about the war. We also did not have a television when we were in Pennsylvania, and we got our first television in either 1966 or 1967. And while I didn't watch it nearly as much as your generation watches television, the evening news would be on, and the evening news would let you know that there was a war going on. So, or that there was, not even sure in 66 or 67 it was called a war, but that there was military action going on that wasn't World War II, and there were also students starting to protest that action on campuses, including Ohio State University. So I became aware again when I was 6 or 7, and really 8 or 9 as the 60s started to end. Not so much because of an awareness of military involvement, but the protests that were starting to develop on college campuses about that military development.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good.
So just at a young age, you just got a gist of what was happening through the protests of the colleges.
Right.
Did you have any understanding why we were entering the Vietnam War?
Yes. And although again we had entered it, we were there, but it was, I was a smart-ass kid who asked questions, and I was also allowed to watch the news with my parents, and it was a bad combination in all sorts of different ways. The initial presentations or the initial answers were simply that this was fighting against communism, or this was fighting against an attempt by Russia to conquer another people. And it was an attempt to do so that didn't involve what we'd call today the nuclear option, but that didn't involve nuclear war. But that's about the extent of it. I'm not sure that again, at 7 or 8, I got more than that. Bad guys were communists. We were the good guys, and a bad country was trying to conquer another country. That's at least the kind of initial sense. As I got older, Dad tried to talk more about the nuances of it. That there were actually 2 Vietnams, and that there were 2. I wouldn't have understood political ideologies, but I know that that's what he's talking about now. There were 2 different groups of Vietnamese people who had 2 very different ideas about how they wanted to run the country, and we were on one side of them. And again, I think that probably has more to do with my father's politics, with my father's coping with and trying to interact with students on his campus, and also his own experience both being taught Vietnamese as an ROTC student at Berkeley, when it looked like our World War II was going to be in the Pacific rather than in Europe. So there were probably a lot of things going on there that I didn't understand, but I think I understood earlier than many of my friends that Vietnam was complicated, and it wasn't just those communists trying to take over non-communists.
Okay. So you watching those television shows about the anti-war protests with the college students, did you have any feelings about their actions, or were you against it?
Well, there were a lot of things going on, and again, it's really hard for me to kind of identify at what point, when I was a kid, I had what thoughts. But somewhere between, I'll use moments that I can date, 68, which is the Kennedy-Nixon, the Humphrey-Nixon presidential election, which is the disturbances at in the Democratic National Convention. Again, I had weird parents and I was a weird kid. I got to stay up past my bedtime for Star Trek and political conventions and national elections. And 68 was probably the first one that I kind of really recognized as it's more than just I get to stay up and watch the returns. My father had also grown up in Whittier, California, which is where Richard Nixon was from. Pat Nixon had been a senior when he was a freshman at Whittier High School. He hated Nixon. He hated Nixon. So again, there's a lot of stuff probably going on in the backdrop here. But 68 was when you got the disruptions at the Democratic National Convention. There were protests outside. There were riot police. That was I think it was the Yippies at that point who would have been kind of organizing it. I don't think it was the Weather Underground yet, but again, it all kind of blew. I was 8. Mm-hmm. What that moment did for me more than anything else was conflate a whole variety of things that I'd thought were separate about the protest movements in the 60s into a single one. One of the things that Dad had done, and again, my timeline on this is going to be a little blurry, so you'll probably want to look it up online someplace, is that as Dean of Humanities, he had okayed a Black Studies department at the university for the first time, and a lot of what I had understood the protests to be about were really about race relations and about civil rights. And I think it's probably 68 where I started to understand that there was protest about civil rights and racial justice, but they're also connected very much to these protests about the draft and about service in Vietnam and about military activity in Vietnam. I think, again, trying to work on particular dates, 72, McGovern ran overtly against the Vietnam War. And by 72, I was 12. So somewhere between 68 and 72, I'd started to recognize that that American troops were fighting in Vietnam, that it was complicated, that why they were there was complicated, and that it wasn't going well. Because, again, somewhere between 68 and 72, regular reports and just numbers of American casualties started to appear on the nightly news. I can't remember if there was a particular news program that we watched. Everybody talks about Walter Cronkite. He was CBS, but I can't remember whether there's a particular one. But again, somewhere between 68 and 72, casualty figures started to be a regular part of it. How's that?
No.
You know, again, the life of a the life of a kid growing up on this. It's very, very surreal, and I'm trying hard to supplant what I know from reading later, what I know from knowing an adult, to what I was thinking, what I was being experienced to as a kid.
Do you remember what were you doing during the Vietnam War time?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to school. I was, I had friends. 72, Nixon won. But the nature of the election meant that any of us who were interested in politics, and again, I was this guy who got to stay up for presidential elections and conventions, meant you had to talk about it. 72, I must have been a 7th grader, and just starting what you'd think of as middle school, what we called junior high school.
Oh, okay.
And I just met a group that was interested in more than the Cincinnati Reds or Ohio State football. That was a little more bookish like me, was a little more interested in politics like me. And again, we're 12, so this sounds ridiculous in retrospect. But it meant we sat around the table talking about the news and talking about things. And Vietnam, in 72, you could not avoid Vietnam in a way that maybe you could have in 67. The two conventions, 68 and 72, had just simply made it necessary. Now, in retrospect, I also know that the Tet Offensive and the reporting of the Tet Offensive had made it part of American discourse in a way that it hadn't. But I at 12, I didn't know that. At 12, it was just this, the 68 convention, the riots in 68, the arguments over 68, Nixon's secret plan to end the the secret plan was 72. And then 72, McGovern putting front and center ending the war. If you talked about politics, even if you were 12, you had to talk about the Vietnam War. 71, and what we talked about was, again, 12-year-old boyness. Why could a country as big as we were, as rich as we were, and as powerful as we were, a country that had beaten the Nazis, why couldn't we beat a bunch of guys in the jungle? A handful of guys in the jungle. And I think at 12, if we're in the war, then it must be the right war. I didn't think in those kinds of terms, but if we're in it, we should be trying to win it. And I'm sorry for the rhyme, but that's kind of the way that we taught. Why wasn't the full force and power of the United States military not being used to win this thing? And it was real clear to me that it wasn't, for all sorts of different reasons. 72, Nixon had campaigned to say that the draft was done. And I didn't realize it until that became part of the campaign, but I just always assumed that, just like older brothers, I didn't have any, but older brothers or friends, and in a couple of cases, uncles of friends, you were going to get to be a certain age and you were going to get your draft number, and there was going to be a lottery, and some of you were going to go and some of you weren't. Until in '72 again, Nixon said, "I'm going to end the draft. We're going to have." Can't remember if he said, if he made it a campaign promise that we're going to end the draft, or if he said, "I'm going to create a committee to study about ending the draft." I vividly remember at the lunch table at Ridgeview Junior High School, all of my friends sitting around and saying and talking about that. If we're drafted, would you go? Because by 12, we'd also come to understand that there were other options. People were going to Canada. People who had been drafted were not going. Now, I didn't understand that there were lots of different ways to get out of the draft without going to Canada. It was, staying or going seemed to be the two options. I didn't understand about deferments. I didn't understand about college and, all those other things. And I certainly didn't understand that there was a disproportionate social class that was going, and one that wasn't. The question simply was, are we going to go? And there was a remarkable difference of opinion among 12-year-old boys eating lunch at Ridgeview Junior High School about whether, if drafted to serve, we'd go. And that, in retrospect, is rather remarkable. Mm-hmm. That something has happened about the confidence of the war effort, and maybe even the nature of the war, that you have 12-year-old boys in conservative Republican suburban Columbus, Ohio, and not all of them are sure this is right. Not all of them are sure that they'd go. And again, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I suspect that that's probably in retrospect. Again, it's probably in accordance with what the country's doing.
Do you remember at all what your thoughts would have been if you were drafted?
Well, again, a lot of this was the kind of catharsis of knowing that it probably wasn't going to happen. Yeah. I mean, of course you will. Of course you would. But yes, a 12-year-old kid who grows up watching World War II movies, doing those things. All right.
So what were your family and friends feeling about the war?
Well,
I think you already mentioned about your friends.
Yeah, and in a sense, there's a fairly wide set of opinions, which is, again, remarkable for 12-year-old boys. Yeah. 12-year-old middle-class boys in suburban Columbus, and I suspect that probably indicates that middle-class white America had lost faith in this by 72 or so. Even though people voted overwhelmingly for Nixon. I mean, Nixon won on a landslide. And it turned out there wasn't a secret plan to end the war. But he did cancel selective service. He did cancel the draft because he figured a volunteer army would still be able to do this. And I've read since then that he also calculated that there would be less opposition to the war if the only people who were fighting in it were people who volunteered to, rather than people who were conscripted. It's sometime in the early 70s, so now, 73, 74, I worked my way through middle school, and I have become more aware of, I guess I've become more of a liberal. My father was a Roosevelt Democrat, and while he always let me have my own opinions, he'd always explain kind of, why he felt things. But it became clearer to me through news reports, through newspaper accounts, through magazine accounts. I can't remember if it's Time or Life had a variety of photographs from Vietnam periodically, that both a whole bunch of folks fighting in Vietnam were people of what we call today people of color, were African American, is what I noticed. And again, in retrospect, I suspect there are a lot of Hispanic Americans too. Folks whom I in my experience, I just wasn't around. And that the conflation that I'd seen on college campuses between race relations and ideas about the war extended into Vietnam. There were a number of reports, and I can't date them, so I don't know exactly when I saw them, but it was when I was in middle school or in high school, of African American troops, if not rioting, reacting negatively to white commands, to other white troops. That it seemed to me that there were a lot of the social problems that I was becoming aware of at home were being replicated at what I thought of then as the front, but in the war then as well. And regularly the reports of not of casualties and of casualties and of casualties and of casualties, and very, very little reports of any kind of military engagements, any kind of change in strategy. Somewhere along in here, American troops started bombing in Cambodia and Laos, but that's the closest thing that I remember to any kind of account of. And okay, now we're taking a step towards victory. We're taking a step towards getting any better.
If any, what ways did the war change your activities or habits?
Well, George McGovern looks a lot better in hindsight than he did in '72. My father would be pleased to hear it. Pleased to hear that if he could. I can't remember the exact year that the war ended. It was '75. The excavation of the abandonment of Saigon. Those are pretty vivid images. Even if I can't date him, I was in high school. The American helicopters flying away, the desperate Vietnamese trying to grab onto the wheels of the last helicopter that came away. That's a pretty vivid image that probably has affected my feeling of America in the world in a lot of different ways. Here was my country, which I liked to think of as standing up for the little guy, as standing up for what was right, patently abandoning that little guy because of its own selfish interests. And I don't know if you can hear in that phrase or kind of a real kind of shift in my politics and in my international politics. I was pretty aware afterwards of they used to call it the domino theory, the idea if you let one place fall, the next would go. And the domino theory looked like it was working, because as soon as American troops pulled out, South Vietnam fell, and then Laos and Cambodia fell, and all of Southeast Asia was now dominated by communists. And leftist as I was becoming, that doesn't make me a communist. I'd read enough about the Soviet Union. I thought enough about, for whatever reasons, I'll always either blame or thank my father. I thought enough about individual liberty and individual and civil rights and equality to know that a communist system would not have done these. So bad things were going to happen in Southeast Asia because of this. And I had a bunch of different geography courses, history courses, government courses through high school, trying to to figure out, okay, what should be happening here. And I think I remember giving one paper in, it must have been a senior in high school then, so what is that, 77? Arguing that the problem here is that there was no overwhelming commitment to a war. There was no overwhelming commitment to win a thing, and that American troops should never be involved in conflict. No nation's troops should ever be involved in conflict that they're not absolutely committed to winning. I'm still not sure I don't believe that. So that's a pretty formative political thought, a little uppity political thought for a 15-year-old to think, but that was certainly one. And I guess maybe the country reflected that too, because we were pretty leery of getting involved in things for a long time after Vietnam. I think the most important post-war experience that I had, that I can identify, is that when I was in high school, I went out for 3.5 years with a young woman, the daughter of a single mother, whose brother had died. And it's a little uncertain whether he died in the war itself or he died in a helicopter crash in the very, very complicated aftermath of moving all American troops and American afterwards. So I'm not sure if he's officially listed as a Vietnam casualty or not, but Terry died in an Army helicopter crash. And the family's just traumatized. I'd been fortunate in that I did not know anybody who had served. I did not know anybody who had died. But Marie and her mother just could not get past losing Terry, and both of them were. I'm sure there's a technical therapeutic term for it right now, but both of them were permanently traumatized by that. And I think not just traumatized by the loss, but traumatized by the pointlessness of the loss. It's after the war, it's after hostilities are done. Again, I don't know whether it was because it's this thing you never asked about. But now I look back and I think that how many families must have been this traumatized for losing a loved one for something that was so patently pointless. And I think that it's part of the larger social and personal coping of the aftermath of the war. That's almost more traumatic than the war itself. The late 70s and the political divides and the social divides, but just the kind of psychological experience of coping with not just losing, but again losing in such a pointless way. That's probably the most significant aspect of Vietnam for me, is just the utter pointlessness of it, and how many families must have been coming to grips with that. Mm-hmm. That's probably why it was so hard to think about memorializing anything. It's probably why there's been such a backlash against any criticism of the soldiers in the war. And my God, there are things to criticize. I can't remember how old I was when the Lieutenant Calley and the My Lai massacre were made public. But that was in the news, and that was pretty traumatic. It got made into a television series, or not television series, a television program with Tony Musante as Lieutenant Calley. He was an actor I liked, so I remember journeying to watch it. And just as that was the kind of the first instance, and again, I'm not sure when in the 70s the film was made, that American troops not only had they been pointless, but they'd been patently unheroic in it. But then I think about Marie and her mom, and they don't want to imagine Terry that way. They don't want to imagine that this was pointless. They don't want to imagine that there was anything unheroic about this. And so I think the backlash, and especially the backlash from people who were not of the Vietnam generation, and I'm just at the tail end of it, mm-hmm. But the backlash to, no, it must have been heroic. We must honor the troops. We must build memorials to this war and to these people. I think that's partly fighting back against this real societal understanding that this was pointless. Mm-hmm. This was just pointless.
Do you know how the soldiers were treated? I know that you weren't involved in the war, or if they got proper care.
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. you hear afterwards about the reaction, and like all of these things, I think there's been a drumbeat in the media and in the not just the news media, but also the politicized media, which is not something that existed when I was growing up, and in in film and entertainment media, that every Vietnam soldier, every veteran who came back was spat on, every veteran who came back was shunned, and I just don't think that that's the case. I suspect that I'm a historian now. I suspect that if we actually were to go and start doing it, you'd find out that there were certain places, probably on the West Coast, where certain of these incidents happened. But for the most part, guys came back, and the 70s were so embroiled in controversy and in social unrest that some of them, like John Kerry, certainly got involved in the anti-war movement, certainly got involved in they're more politicized, but most folks just came back and tried to get normal. Obviously, many couldn't. Now, again, I don't know anybody with PTSD, but that was, it was either the late 70s or the early 80s that I first heard the phrase PTSD. And Shirley Marie and her mom would have been diagnosed with something similar to that. Again, we weren't seeing each other then, I don't think the diagnosis had existed, especially for civilians, but I didn't know enough veterans to be able to do anything other than respond to what I saw in the media, kind of the stuff.
Okay. Do you think you could tell me a specific experience from the Vietnam War that you can't forget, or your most vivid memory of that time period?
Yeah, I think I can go to two. And again, if you, and these are kind of dateable memories in the one sense that maybe I'll even give you a third, although that one's less dateable. You'd have to go back and see exactly when the My Lai massacre was first brought into media attention. But sometime in the late 70s or the early 80s, a television program called Great Trials was on, and one of them was the trial of Lieutenant Calley. Again, an actor that I'd kind of followed, played Lieutenant Calley, so I tuned in to watch it. And it became clear over the course of this that Lieutenant Calley had either been ordered to or ordered a massacre of innocent civilians at this village in Vietnam. And that's the kind of real dateable moment that, okay, this is not good guys and bad guys anymore, and if it is, we may not be the good guys in this. It's after the conflict itself had ended, so it's really me thinking about my country and my country's involvement in it. But that space between the reporting of the My Lai massacre, the acknowledgement of it, and the television program that dramatized it, was a pretty significant moment. And okay, I've got to really rethink good guys, the World War II good guys and bad guys image that I'd grown up with in my country. So that's one. First year in Ridgeview Junior High School, which would have made me 12 or 13, it would have been 1972 or 1973, sitting around talking about, okay, if there's a draft, if we're drafted, are we going to go? Are we not? Mm-hmm. I think spoke to again, this is me looking back on that moment. I think spoke to the kind of subconscious perpetuality, if that's a word, of the conflict. This had been something that had been going on literally all of my life. And certainly all of my conscious life, if we say I began getting conscious in 67 or 68. all of my friends just assumed that this war had been going on all of our lives and was likely to be going on all of our lives. And that we were all going to have to make a choice at some point. And again, that's pretty remarkable when you look back and think about it. And even more remarkable when you think that Afghanistan and Iraq have been going on longer than Vietnam did, without a draft, without even the threat of a draft. But so I suppose those are the two kind of really vivid moments that I recognize from that era. But there's a third too, and this goes back again to my dad. I connect an awful lot of the 60s and the 70s to the Ohio State University, to my father, who had a role in it. I mean, and maybe just I connect an awful lot of my childhood to my father. Dad was a traditional liberal Democrat. He fought in World War II, believing that he was fighting for, the whole long laundry list of what we'd call liberal ideas: free speech, free elections, freedom of choice, equality among races. And as Dean of the Humanities at Ohio State University, had tried to lead the university in that same way, or lead the humanities division in that same way. He had reasoned that, and if we can have a classical studies department, then African American culture, we called it black then, would have deserved its own study and deserved its own importance as well. And so, a white administrator had overseen and encouraged the creation of a black studies department. Kent State shootings happened, I want to say 72, but I could be wrong. Again, that's bad for a historian to admit, but I didn't prep here. I didn't go back and look. And riots broke out on campuses throughout. Kent State was a state university in Ohio. Riots broke out all over at virtually every state university. A whole lot of these things that, in retrospect, I gathered were simmering just blew up. And there were a couple of days that Dad couldn't get home from the university because it was just, coming out of the office was too bad. And one day he did come home, and he came home with a big chunk of concrete that had gotten thrown into his office, through his office window. And by people protesting against the Vietnam War, against the shooting of the students at Kent State, and for equal rights and civil rights. And I remembered thinking, and I think I asked him this, but it was, I'm not sure how much of this is a constructed memory. Dad's been on the right side of this. He's been in favor of Black Studies Department. He's been increasingly against the war. He's supporting McGovern here. Yet people are throwing stuff into his office. And I'm still not sure how I'm processing all of this. I'm still not sure what to make of this, but that whole problem of good guys and bad guys and black and white, not in racial terms, but just in clear lines of demarcation. It was clear to me, and I was again 12 or 13, that everything's gray, everything's complicated. And I don't know, maybe this is the era when a lot of Americans came to understand that everything's complicated. And maybe that's why we had such a backlash about that now. Well, no, there's right and wrong and nothing's complicated, because you've got a generation coming out of the 70s that came to understand that everything's complicated.
So transitioning to the war ending, do you think it was right for America to be at war? Why or why not?
No, not that war, not the way we got into it. Knowing what I know now, but also knowing how it was prosecuted. the Vietnamese overwhelmingly would have preferred to have their own country. They would have preferred to have been led by Vietnamese leaders whom they elected. They happened to elect Ho Chi Minh, who happened to be a communist. Our intervention in Vietnam was directly contrary to the free democratic election, or the free wishes expressed democratically by the Vietnamese people. So, no, we shouldn't have been involved in it.
How did you feel when the war ended?
Well, and again, I tried to, that image again of Vietnamese people trying to hang on to the helicopter as the helicopter abandons. This was not a proud moment to be an American. And then to have Kissinger and Nixon talking about how this was either peace with honor or a victory was pretty clearly not the case. It was pretty Orwellian, actually. If we were there to help these people and there to protect these people, we should have stayed. If we were not there to help these people and protect these people, what the hell were we doing there to begin with? And that's a pretty vivid thought after the war. Years later, in the 1980s, I was a graduate student in the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1986. And I haven't quite worked this out, either the children of the boat people, that swarm of refugees that came out of Southeast Asia in the wake of the war, or the boat people themselves, and I'm not sure. I think that the kids that I had in 86 and 87 would probably have been infants on those boats or born shortly after they hit American shores. And they were not well received by Californians, by Americans. They had a pretty hard life. And I remember thinking, and again, this is 86 now, so in theory I'm grown up. These folks exist because we screwed up in that country. And we're so ungrateful, and we are so hard-hearted that not only did we screw their country up, but now that they've come here and tried to become part of our country, we're screwing them up here too. And I think that attitude or that understanding influenced my political ideas about what we were doing in Central America, where all during the Reagan years we were prosecuting these wars by proxy against people and creating refugees who then came here, who then get discriminated against. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say that my experience growing up during the Vietnam era has created my politics, but I'm not sure that somebody listening to me wouldn't think that.
Okay. What do you think we could have done differently about the war?
12-year-old me would have said, use the full might and force of the United States military to win it quickly, which 56-year-old me recognizes probably would have involved direct military confrontation with either the Soviet Union or the Communist Chinese, both nuclear powers then. I think if we believe in democracy, if we believe in free elections, then a free election that doesn't go the way we want it to is still a free election. And the thing to really have done differently would have been not to have gotten involved in the first place, not to have tried to manipulate the electoral process, not to have created an artificial South Vietnam separate from North Vietnam. And this is Johnson really, as much as Kennedy. But I think the other thing that we could have done, and I thought about this a lot not so much in terms of Vietnam, but because of Iraq and Afghanistan. We should not ever create a situation in which only some of us have to sacrifice and only some of us have to send loved ones to fight for this country. If it's important enough to engage in military action, it's important enough for the entire population to be behind it. You know, we keep talking about the good war in World War II. One of the things that made that the good war is that, at least in theory, everybody was behind it. Everybody was called to serve, and if you weren't called to serve, you were called to pay for it back here, either by work or by money. And Vietnam was the first war. I wasn't alive for Korea, but Vietnam was the first war that was patently not the case. And we should be learning. We should have learned from that, and either not gotten involved, or if we are going to get involved as a community, get involved as a society. I'll end it there.
Once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were some things permanently changed?
I think things were permanently changed. And again, I think of Murray and her family, that just, you don't recover from a pointless death, and a pointless death on behalf of your country. You just don't recover from that. And so many families must have dealt with that. But at the same time, the end of the war coincided with civil rights issues, with women's liberation, with a variety of social issues, as the country shifted from, again, the World War II generation to whatever we're going to call that generation that came next, the baby boomers, I suppose. So nothing was normal, and to blame it all on the war. I mean, the war is a symptom of abnormality, but not the only cause of it.
Have you ever thought about joining the military later on?
No. They wouldn't have me, first off. But no, I think the last conscious thought about that was when I, at that middle school that junior high school table in 72 or 73. Selective service came back during the Iran crisis of the late 70s. Maybe it was 79, maybe 80, when Carter reinstituted selective service. And I was in college, but I came back, and my mother was actually at the kitchen table then. She said, if you need to talk to an attorney, if we need to talk about what your rights are for this, if you don't want to do it, we can do that. But no, I've not ever thought about joining the military.
Okay. How did the rest of your life essentially go?
Well, you get inklings of it, I suppose, in this. I don't know. I suppose I've grown up to become my father in a lot of different ways, albeit at a lower income level and a more rural situation. So yeah, and I'm not sure that all of that is attributed to growing up in the 70s, but I think it certainly cemented a suspicion of conformity and a suspicion of my own government's willingness or ability to tell me the truth about things. As I said, throughout the 80s, throughout the Reagan years, I was deeply, deeply suspicious of military involvement in Central America and the Caribbean. I think, and we can argue about whether this is my father, this is a whole variety of things. I think that era has made me come to understand and think about a relationship between social justice, political action, military action. It was so easy in the 1960s to see Vietnam in terms of bad communists and good allies. By the end of the 70s, it was much easier for me to see, and in hindsight, it's certainly much easier for me to see a relationship between economic and social injustice, maybe racial injustice, and the political events of Southeast Asia.
Okay. If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be? And if you could elaborate on why you chose that one word.
Oh, the cop-out word is mistake.
Mistake, okay.
You know, and that is a cop-out.
Okay.
That you can't argue that it was complicated and not at least give the various planners of the war, McNamara, I've forgotten, Westmoreland, the right to have made mistakes because it was complicated. But I think, boy, a single word. Yeah. I don't know if I can do it in a single word, but it's certainly the end of maybe for a generation, it's the end of an ability to see the world in black and white. Vietnam is gray. It is a colossal shade of gray in which a whole lot of absolute certainties turn out not to have any certainty to them at all. American heroism, American exceptionalism, evil communists, good guys and bad guys, right decisions and wrong decisions, victory and defeat, all of those things are much, much less certain in thinking about Vietnam than they should have been.
Okay. What conclusions would you draw about the war?
I think I probably just said it. I mean, it's the end of the World War II consensus, or World War II understanding in a lot of different ways.
Right.
It's the end of a certainty in American culture, and even the kind of new certainty that's come back, the new absolute America right or wrong kind of stuff, or in the face of the end of the Cold War, 9/11, or any of these things. That's a very, very defensive certainty.
Okay.
It's not the same kind of certainty that you had in the 1950s or the early 1960s. Vietnam killed that we're always right, that we're always good, our leaders always know what they're doing. That's gone.
All right. So what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
Again, I think you've probably gotten that through a lot of the stuff that I've taught. Just that nothing's ever simple. It's always complicated. There are many more shades of gray than we like to talk about. That's probably the mushy shade of gray kind of answer to that. I think politically and militarily there should have been some doctrine change.
Okay.
And maybe there has. The American military has gone to school on counterinsurgency and what they call asymmetrical warfare. And a lot of that's been applied, I think, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. How well, how carefully, I mean, that's for somebody who's more expert than me to determine, but I think that there are those sort of rules. The political rules about telling the truth and not lying to your population and expecting the same level of sacrifice from all levels of society, those haven't been learned at all.
Okay. Have your views on the war changed over time?
I think so, and again, for ways I've thought that I've become an historian. I've started to look at how I've looked at how conflicts develop. I've looked at how ethnic and national identity gets formed. So in a sense, I've been trained to see things as more complicated than they are. I suppose I've gone from saying this is my country, therefore we should win it, to stupid country, we abandon everything, all of our principles there, and for what? To maybe a more mature understanding that not the inevitability of it, but the I think I can understand why some of the mistakes got made. I can't forgive them, but I can understand them.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to share that I forgot to mention?
No, I think again, I'm the tail end of that generation, so you probably got much better stories and much more stuff from folks older than I am. But
Awesome. Would like to thank you so much for sharing this interview and your experience with me.
all right, happy to.
Thank you so much.
You bet.